on Marty Doan now to push in a little closer. You can see in his live shot, it has gotten fairly bad over there near the mall entrance to the Pentagon. 11 hours after a Boeing 757 bound from Dulles Airport to Los Angeles was hijacked by terrorists who crashed it into the Pentagon, where it exploded like a giant bomb, blowing a huge hole in the side of the building, 6 stories high, and it is feared killing and seriously wounding many inside. In his speech tonight, the president tried to reassure the nation, saying thousands, though, were killed in these attacks. He repeated his pledge to find those who did it and punish those responsible for it. And he said pointedly, quote, he will make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor them. That is a fairly clear warning to terrorist nations who may have assisted in some way in these attacks, that they may suffer attacks on their infrastructure, that this response will be more than what we have seen many times in the past, where there have been strikes against so-called terrorist staging areas. And just before the president spoke, the Secretary of Defense met with the Joint Chiefs. They held a brief news conference here. They said that the casualties could be fairly heavy in this section, and they said business, though, will resume here tomorrow. The Pentagon will be open. The outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Hugh Shelton, denounced the acts as barbarous acts of terrorism, and he said the U.S. military stands ready to deal with it. Kathleen, Maureen.
Jim, thank you very much. Now, the Army has set up a hotline, we understand, to have people call so that they can account for all of the workers at the Pentagon. So if you were assigned to the Pentagon, they ask you to call one of these 2 numbers, 1-800-984-8523 or 703-428-0002. Now, again, this hotline is not for the public to call with questions. This is only for Army personnel who are assigned to the Pentagon or for family members of those personnel who are looking for information about their loved ones who work for the Army and the Pentagon. And then coming up in 30 minutes, we're going to have numbers to call for the other branches of the military. Maureen?
Kathleen, of course, the district was declared in a state of emergency today by Mayor Williams. The mayor has extended that state of emergency through September 26th. Because of that, the Postal Service will not deliver mail in the district tomorrow.
And it will not quite be business as usual for local schools. We have a lot of school closings that have come to us just in the last half hour, beginning with Anne Arundel County schools, also Beauvoir, a private school in the district, Calverton School. All D.C. public schools will be closed tomorrow. Falls Church City schools will be closed. All Fairfax County and all Montgomery County schools will be closed.
Also closed National Cathedral School, Potomac School, Prince George's County Schools, Prince William County Schools, St. Stephen's and St. Agnes School, and St. Albans School.
We're going to rejoin ABC News, now in progress. Meanwhile, we'll be back in another half hour with an update. Thanks for joining us.
Symbols of New York, the World Trade Center towers, are simply gone.
Diane Sawyer giving us what it was like, at least from a distance, because we've all been at a distance from this, what it was like in those first moments. Now let's look at it from another perspective, because ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, as we've said several times today, is able, I think, to take you there, Lisa?
I am, Peter.
Lisa's in Seattle today, where she's been out at the Boeing company. It was Boeing jets, Boeing equipment, 757s and 767s involved. Why don't you just walk us through what you and we now know about how this unfolded from the point of view of the hijackers?
All right, I will, but Peter, I want to give you a little bit of new information first, if I may. There's a meeting going on, we understand, between the Federal Aviation Administration and the major carriers at this point. They are trying to determine how they might be able to get air service back up and going again tomorrow, what steps would need to be taken. We do understand from a number of sources that one of the things they are considering is a resumption of the Air Marshal program. That would be armed air marshals that would actually fly on a number of flights. Now, that happens now in the United States, but it's a very small percentage of flights. It's unclear whether they would ramp up to every flight. That seems unlikely. But whether they are considering whether they would put air marshals on a number of flights as a precaution throughout the United States. One of the options that they are talking about.
Okay, just before you go to your chronology then, let
Yes.
me remind people that what you mean by air service back up is because hundreds of airplanes and thousands of passengers. An extraordinary job of air traffic control and pilots getting planes safely on the ground when the FAA decided everybody should land at the nearest possible airport, many of which are in Canada. And so there are thousands of people stranded far away from home tonight, safe, but when you refer to air service being got back up again, you basically mean getting the nation's air communication systems back up and running.
Absolutely. There's a national ground stop throughout the United States until at least noon tomorrow. It's going to be a massive task to get the system up and running, and obviously the main concern is to do it safely, to make sure that we don't have a repeat of the horrible events that we saw today. So there are security issues that are paramount, and there are also simply operational issues. How do you sort of turn the switch back on and get as many as 40,000 flights every day in the United States back in the air? And those discussions about that are underway right now, we understand.
We'll all follow that one. Now take us, if you would, through the movement of the aircraft which were ultimately and fatally involved.
What we know is that American Airlines Flight 11 was the first plane involved. That was the plane, a 767, en route from Boston's Logan Airport to Los Angeles. The plane took off shortly after 8 o'clock, we understand. About a half hour into the flight, it made a sharp left turn down towards New York. There were massive changes in airspeed apparently at that time. As the plane then headed toward Manhattan, it slowed and slammed into the World Trade Tower. It had been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, at the same time this was going on, there was a United Airlines 767, Flight 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles. It also was in the air, taken over by hijackers. That plane made a turn towards New Jersey, then made virtually a U-turn and came up toward the Trade Tower from the south, came over Staten Island. It slammed into the second Trade Tower. It had also been in the air about 45 minutes. Now, before any of these planes actually hit the World Trade Center, a third plane, a United Airlines 757, American Airlines American Airlines 757, it was Flight 77 from Dulles, had taken off. It was bound for Los Angeles as well. We don't know much about the flight path of that plane. We believe it was in the air about 1 hour before it hit the Pentagon. Then we have the fourth plane, United Flight 93, another 757, en route from Newark to San Francisco. We are unclear about the departure time. We have some conflicting information about that, whether it was close to 8 o'clock or closer to 8:45. It did depart Newark Airport. It appears that hijackers may have taken control of the plane over Cleveland. That is when it suddenly made a turn back toward the east. We also understand that sometime at that point, someone from the cockpit called the FAA and requested a change in flight plan. They said, we're not going to San Francisco. We want to go to Washington, D.C., to DCA, which is National Airport. It's unclear whether there was another Washington target, perhaps, that this plane was aiming for. Either way, it didn't make it all the way to Washington. It crashed in Pennsylvania. A total of 266 passengers and crew on all four of these planes. The toll could have been even much, much worse on the jetliners because they were very lightly filled. They can hold anywhere from 185 to 250 people. The most crowded plane had 90 passengers and crew members on it. Peter, we also want to mention, if we can, that as this was unfolding, people on board these planes were able to communicate what was going on. We know some details about that. We know on Flight 11, that was the American Airlines flight, the first one that hit the World Trade Tower, a flight attendant was able to call the American Airlines Operations Center. The flight attendant informed them that a number of flight attendants had been stabbed and that the perpetrators had stormed the cockpit. She was also able to tell them, apparently, the seat number of at least one of the hijackers. She was able to give them that information. We also know that there were some cell phone calls from at least 2 of the other planes. There was a cell phone call, as you have reported earlier, from the plane that slammed into the Pentagon, a woman calling her husband, saying that these hijackers were on board, that they had box cutters, those sorts of knives, and they had herded all of the passengers into the back of the plane. And we understand there was also a cell phone call on the United 175 flight. That was the other flight that hit the World Trade Tower. Apparently, a son on that plane called his father from his cell phone and also said there were hijackers on board with knives. So we do know that as the events were unfolding, what was going on 30,000 feet above the United States was being communicated. Of course, unfortunately, there was nothing the people on the ground could do about any of this except watch in horror as these planes ended up where they ended up.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa Stark, who has given us a very clear picture many times today on what precisely happened, or at least as much as we know of what happened. Thank you. On board those planes, we do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations. People have been getting onto sites on the web, which is a very good, vigorous way for people, very good way for people to communicate. Some of the things people have been telling us at ABC News, at abcnews.com, after today, nothing changes. Sorry, everything changes. Nothing will ever be the same. The way you've lived your life, enjoyed your freedom, your very personal expression, it all changes after today. From someone else, only a month ago, I laid on a bench outside the World Trade Center and marveled at what man could create, looking up at those 110 stories, and now I stare in disbelief at what man can take away. I want retribution, said one person to abcnews.com, and that's a sentiment that has been widely, deeply expressed in the heart of the political establishment in Washington and by people in every walk of life across the country. And as George Stephanopoulos and Leon Panetta, the former White House Chief of Staff, have made very clear, and as the President clearly knows already, one of the things the President has to do is be patient and understand who it is who did this before the country can do anything by way of retaliation. He's a slightly chilling one. If they can pull off an act like this, they are certainly capable of eventually sending nuclear weapons this way. And this is very interesting. How can people keep calling it the modern Pearl Harbor? At least we knew who we were up against back then. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was a surprise to a great many Americans in the middle of afternoon ball games. This is the first time today that Major League Baseball has ever canceled all its games since D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in World War II. And one of the enormously frustrating things for the intelligence establishment, for the political establishment, for all of us in the country today, not to mention anyone else in the world who was a friend of the United States, perhaps even a foe, is to understand who it was who actually did this. And the reverberations from this are indeed global. Air traffic, we already know, listening to Lisa Stark and our own reporting earlier today, is snarled around the world, especially in Europe. The impact of what happens there in terms of transportation and commerce. The stock exchange was closed today. It all has an effect somewhere else. Any place there is a proposed mass gathering, in many parts of the world, they are rethinking it. In Germany, they have now canceled the Frankfurt car show, which is one of the biggest car shows, if not the biggest car show in the world. There's some consideration to canceling the Oktoberfest, the great beer and culture festival in Munich, in Germany. France has called a general security alert, and I'm just told that Ted Koppel is with us in London live. Ted has been in London and now can go even further than that, please, Ted, on telling us what's happened in Europe and as much as you know elsewhere.
Well, I must tell you, Peter, I've spent the better part of this day trying to get from where I was, which about 12 hours ago was in Italy, to where you are. And as you well know, and as you've been reporting for much of the day, getting into the United States from overseas is a very difficult task indeed. But it's just about, what time is it here? 2:15 in the morning here in London. And some of the early editions of the newspapers have come through, and I thought you might like to take a look at them. Let me hold them up. There's not a great deal that differentiates the tabloids today from the more serious newspapers. You can see it: Apocalypse, New York, September 11th, says the Daily Mail. Declaration of war, says the Daily Express. And then this one, which perhaps goes farther than it might: is this the end of the world, from the Daily Star? And so it goes. The Mirror, war on the world. The Sun, the day that changed the world. And now one of the more serious newspapers, the Independent, and again the same horrific pictures that we have been seeing all day long. And the Independent says, Doomsday America, the times of London when war came to America. And so it has gone. And I must tell you, Peter, the only thing I can tell you is, as you know, when we're overseas, American tourists tend to turn to folks like us, expecting that we know something. I'm afraid I knew less than they did. It was some other tourists who informed me earlier in the day of what had happened, and I went rushing back to my hotel room and packed while I was watching the television scenes that you have been reporting on all day. And all I can tell you is that this was a day when, as soon as people found out you were an American, they turned to you with expressions of grief, expressions of horror, expressions of outrage, and an offer to do anything they could do to help, which in my case meant getting a little bit closer to New York or Washington. Peter?
Ted, have you managed, I totally sympathize with what you've gone through today, and as bad as a day it is for many Americans, I understand what you mean when you say it's been a good day to be reminded that people around the world admire and sympathize with Americans, suffer with it. Can you give us some sense, if you have any whatsoever, just from looking at the reporting there, as to how governments are responding as well as individuals?
Well, again, Peter, and you've been in this situation often enough to be sympathetic to it. I literally just landed in London. We had to charter from Paris to get over here because flying into Heathrow wasn't that easy, especially at this time of night. And have only landed now and been reading the wires in the car coming in. And I do know that Tony Blair has expressed strong condemnation and, of course, a sense of oneness with the United States. Perhaps, Peter, the most interesting thing that I've heard, and just read a little bit of a transcript of a television newscast that came out of Tehran earlier this evening, is that the Iranian president, Khatami, is quoted by Iranian anchors earlier this evening as expressing his outrage and offering to help in any way that he can against this form of worldwide terrorism. Coming from Iran, that is quite remarkable, as I'm sure you know.
I do indeed, though perhaps a little more understandable coming from President Khatami, who is regarded as the president of Iran, who, as you well know, is trying to move the country closer to some kind of sense of democratic representation than others in the country are willing him to do. But I think we've all known for a long time that sometimes elements within the Iranian political establishment, or on the edges of the political establishment, operate in ways that other parts of the political establishment are not aware of. At any rate, I won't...
Right. But no, go ahead, Peter.
No, I was just going to say, I don't want to impose on you anymore, because I know you want to, I know, like anybody else arriving on scene, you want to sit down and get as much as you can. So please come back to us at any time that you want. You want to add something now?
Just one thing, and I realize compared to what everyone has been going through in the United States today, and especially the citizens of New York and Washington, this seems like a small thing, but I'm sure it was reflected today thousands, if not tens of thousands of times. Being overseas and picking up the phone, I've got 3 youngsters, as you know, who live in New York City. Just trying to get through on the phone today could be such a trial. And 2 of my youngsters, 3 of them actually, work down in downtown New York. And all I can tell you is you stop being a newsman real fast, and all you want to do is be a father and find out that the kids are all right and that everything is okay. And for so many, many people today, Americans around the world still wondering at this late hour what's happened to their loved ones. All I can tell you is the grief and the sympathy of the world goes out to all.
You're absolutely right, Ted. And as a man, as I just said just before we joined you, just got off the phone with at least one of his kids and the other is trying to call him. I totally appreciate it. We'll let you go to work. Please come back anytime, anytime that you feel like it with news from overseas. But as Ted indicates, when he holds up the tabloids, sometimes known as the popular newspapers and the more serious broadsheet newspapers in Britain, they all have those same headlines that this strike on America has somehow changed things. And it's not as if the United States, in the wake of Oklahoma City, was not aware that it could happen on the American mainland. But they use phrases like apocalypse now in the movie sense, among other things, and just make you realize how deeply this has felt and what impact it's had in other parts of the world. It's interesting that several, well, it's interesting in a very minor way, that several people today have noted the oddity of the date, 9th day of the 11th month, as the 3 digits of the emergency number 911. George, I'll be with you in a minute, George Stephanopoulos. We've kept John McCarthy at the Pentagon, who's been frustrated, John, I think a little because they forced you to stay. Have they forced you to stay where you are and will not let you get into your normal listening post inside the Pentagon?
That's right. The security around the Pentagon is extreme. We have been allowed to get cameras a little closer on a very restricted basis, Peter. That was where we were able to take pictures of some of the bodies lined up outside the Pentagon, some of the grim evidence. You were talking about people worrying about their loved ones. Well, calls are going out from the Defense Department tonight of those bodies that have been identified. There are still many, many missing in the rubble of the Pentagon, so that search goes on tonight. You may notice behind me there are still fires burning on the roof of the Pentagon. They have been struggling all day to put out these fires, and they have moved along the rim of the Defense Department, and they break through. The firemen go up on the roof in very heroic efforts. They break through the roof. It breathes air, and that gives the fire new life, and then they pour water down those infernos as they burn. So the fight is still continuing here at the Pentagon to try and bring the fires under control so they can go after those people who are still trapped in the rubble. John, we're looking at a second graphic. We had one earlier today which appeared to show that the depth or the width of the tragedy, not to mention the depth into that inner courtyard. And you described the great gash across the building as being, I think, about 200 feet wide. Is my sense tonight that fire has spread to places where you didn't anticipate it was going to spread earlier in the day? There are fires that have spread along air ducts and along the very top attic section of the Pentagon, well beyond where the actual gash was. But Peter, the destruction, as the plane hit the Pentagon at an oblique angle, it dumped some of the fuel, apparently, in an explosive blast in one direction, and the damage is far, far worse on one side of the gash on the Pentagon than it is on the other. And it looks to be the side on the right to our eye here. Am I right about that? Looked at from your perspective? Correct. Okay. That's correct. John McCarthy, thank you very much indeed again. We're going to stay in the Washington area now because Claire Shipman, the House Intelligence Committee has just had a briefing, and I believe that Claire, you've managed to get a briefing from someone in the Intelligence Committee to tell us what went on. News. Hang on a sec, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can, now go ahead.
All right, sorry, trouble with my sound tonight. What we were told from Democratic and Republican leadership sources on Capitol Hill is that they had a briefing, an intelligence briefing, a little bit earlier today from members of the intelligence community, including the CIA, and that they were told, quote, the CIA had some hard facts, and of course this won't surprise you, that were pointing to Osama bin Laden. In fact, the source told me they were surprised how blunt the CIA was with them at this point. we've also been told, it's interesting, Peter, even in the midst of all of this tragedy today, that there was a little bit of grumbling in Washington. Some members of Congress frustrated that they weren't hearing from the president, that the president wasn't back in Washington. But the leadership says that they absolutely understand why the president was traveling around the country today, and that they have the scene we saw on Capitol Hill earlier of bipartisanship was not an act, that it's very genuine. The leadership was briefed 4 times by Vice President Cheney earlier today. They didn't hear from Bush directly, but they were very happy with what they heard from him tonight. They're planning to convene tomorrow to pass a piece of legislation condemning all of the terror, and then it's not clear whether or not they're going to stay in session. They're trying to decide how much sense that makes and how appropriate it is.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. We'll come back. We'll come back to you as the evening wears on. I know there are people in the country who will express this sentiment, so I express it as much on behalf of other people. We believe at this point we knew absolutely nothing in advance, and we've said that several, if not several dozen times today, and here we are within minutes, I shouldn't take that back, within hours of an incident involving terrorists about which we've heard not much throughout the day, and already we have someone in the Intelligence Committee, or maybe it's through a member of Congress, pointing the finger at Osama bin Laden. I'll turn to George Stephanopoulos to talk about this a little bit, and then perhaps to talk to our defense analysis in Washington in just a moment. Tony, the skeptics just say, oh, they point the finger at Osama bin Laden.
Because it's easy, and we need a face.
Exactly.
We need a face.
We need someone to demonize.
And someone to blame, and someone to demonize, and someone to attack. And I think there'll probably be some grumbling from the Central Intelligence Agency and others in the intelligence community that information like this was frankly leaked out of the House Intelligence Committee or out of the Congress, because that's one of their big complaints consistently with the Congress. Is one of the reasons we can't trust the Intelligence Committee with this information is because the minute we talk about it, it gets out in the public domain. But I do think it does speak to something that we'll see happening in the coming days.
Before you go on to the coming days, I apologize. Don't want to hold you up except this. Do you think, from your experiences in government, that there is a tendency to blame Osama bin Laden even when there is not necessarily any basis on which to precisely point the finger at him? I don't mean that Osama bin Laden gave money to someone in the country, but within hours of this, we're beginning to point at the same man we point to in almost every instance.
I would say a tendency to find a specific target that you can blame as quickly as possible, not necessarily Osama bin Laden. But I remember very well in early 1993, after former President Bush, there was an assassination attempt against him.
Right.
The FBI and the CIA spent several weeks trying to find out who was responsible. They finally did identify people, but there was an awful lot of pressure from the people on the ground, especially to say, yes, 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 we have it. And you felt that a lot of people further back in Washington were saying, are you sure?
Yeah, I think the public is pretty actually wise about this now, because we've been through so many experiences where we thought it was Iran, and maybe it turned out to be Libya. We thought it turned out to be Libya, and then the suspect was Syria, and it turned out to be Palestine. Thought it was Palestinians, and it turned out to be an American.
And one other thing, not to discount, Peter, I'm not suggesting this is happening in this case, but you always have to be careful. Those who are doing the briefings may have an agenda of their own within the government trying to build pressure for an action they want.
Now, you were going to, before you go on to your other point, Claire Shipman mentioned that they were going to pass legislation tomorrow, which will be national legislation respectful of the day.
And support for the president.
And support for the president and support for the various government agencies. There's very quickly going to be a demand and request for doing something more than already, and money.
For much more. And whenever you have these kinds of terrorist acts, whether it was Oklahoma City or the assassination attempt on President Bush or the Khobar Towers Congress acts, remember, after TWA Flight 800, we first got those questions that were asked of every air passenger. Have your bags been with you at all times? And has anyone else, have they ever been out of your sight? That was never asked before. You'll see something far more stringent, I would guess, coming onto Congress now. Far more attempts after the Oklahoma City bombing. There were attempts to increase the FBI's wiretapping capabilities and tracing gunpowder and other kinds of ammunition, and also after Al-Khobar, more money for intelligence. You'll see that coming out of the Congress.
But you make a very good point, and we discussed it a little earlier today. I've forgotten, I think it was James Woolsey we began talking to, and pointing out that how important it is for Americans at the moment to appreciate freedoms in the country. And I think it was somebody very early in the day who quoted Edmund Burke when he talked about ordered liberty, because there will be pressure in some communities in pursuit of international terrorism to make it tougher for Americans to enjoy all of their freedoms. Do you believe that?
No question about it. After Oklahoma City, there was even an attempt to start to catalog these domestic militias in a way that we would have never done before that, and that was something, there was an outcry at the time, but I would suspect that after something like this, people will say, we're willing to sacrifice some liberties in order to get the security.
Okay, thanks, George.
From ABC 7 News, this is a special report. Continuing coverage, America Under Attack.
Good evening. I'm Maureen Bunyan with Kathleen Matthews at ABC 7 News. All evening long, we've been trying to keep you up to date on the local implications and the local effect of these horrific events that have taken place in New York and also here in Washington at the Pentagon today.
Now, while many government buildings will be reopening tomorrow, that is not the case for many of our public schools. We want to bring you up to date on that situation because I know you and your children are interested in this. D.C. public and charter schools will be closed again tomorrow. In Maryland, Anne Arundel, Montgomery County and Prince George's County schools all will be closed. Here's the situation in Virginia. Closed tomorrow will be Fairfax County schools, Falls Church schools, Fauquier County schools, Loudoun County schools, Manassas Park schools, and Prince William County schools.
And some information for you on the mass transit situation in the area. Metro Rail will be open tomorrow, but the Pentagon and National Airport stations remain closed. Metro buses that normally serve Pentagon Metro Rail Station will instead be staged at the Pentagon City Station.
ABC 7 News reporter Susan Roberts is live tonight at the Dulles Airport Marriott. Of course, Dulles is where the American Airlines flight that ultimately crashed into the Pentagon originated. Susan, tell us what the scene is there tonight.
Well, Kathleen, basically this area has just been a hub for the press. We have seen a lot of passengers that were stranded here. People trying to get in and out of Dulles have had to just camp out here overnight, about 85 to 90. Originally, this was set up, though, actually for the victims' family members. We are told by American Airlines support personnel as well as the Red Cross that they've only seen about 10 of the family members of some of the 58 passengers that were on that American Airlines flight number 77 bound for Los Angeles that actually crashed in the Pentagon. Now, earlier today at the airport, it was just basically a ghost town except for a few FBI members that came over late in the day. They came through, swept around with a few dogs, looked in some trash cans, tried to gather any kind of clues as to what might have happened and how this airplane actually crashed. Right now, we're just getting a sense that the Red Cross and American Airlines just wants to make a point, wants those family members to know that they are based here, that they can come here for support. They believe right now, just initial reports coming in, that only actually 20 of these victims' family members are based here in the Virginia area. So they're expecting maybe 10 more, if that at all, tonight. So that's basically the scene here right now. We did speak with a priest earlier. He described a very somber scene in the center tonight where they are holding prayers and a nice vigil for all those family members out there. We hope to have more for you a little bit later on ABC 7 News. We're live in Fairfax County. I'm Susan Roberts, ABC 7. Kathleen?
Somber scene. Susan, thank you very much.
We are going back to the Pentagon for a live picture of the rescue efforts there. The fire is still continuing at the Pentagon. Pentagon officials have begun to notify families of the victims of this horrible situation, of this tragedy. Also, we've learned that rescue teams are traveling overnight to Washington to help in the recovery of bodies at the Pentagon, and those rescue teams are coming in from Nashville and Virginia Beach.
We want to give you some numbers for family members. If you're personnel with the Army and you want to get information or you'd like to report in to say that you're safe, here's the number to call, 1-800-984-8523, or a second number is 703-428-0002. Again, they'd like to hear from all Army personnel who do work at the Pentagon so they can get an accounting of their personnel.
And we also have some numbers for you from the Navy and the Marine Corps. The number to call for them is 1-877-663-6772. And the Air Force is offering us this number, 1-800-253-9276. And of course, those numbers are for you to report in that you're safe and also to find out about the status of your family members who may be in the Pentagon. We go back now to ABC News.
and one could argue international life at the moment. ABC's Betsy Stark, who covers the stock market, national business affairs, and international business affairs, is with us at the moment. Betsy, put together for us, if you will, the picture of a world, or much of the world, that has been brought to a halt in many ways by these incidents today.
Well, Peter, we're certainly reminded that we have a global economy and global markets. European and Latin American markets had a chance to respond to events today. As you know, U.S. financial markets were closed all day, but markets in Europe and Latin America were down sharply. Trading was halted in some of them. Asia is now having its first opportunity to react to these events, and in Japan, the Nikkei is down around 6.5%. It's been open for about an hour and a half now. Incidentally, that's the lowest level in 15 years. You know, the U.S. has been the world's real economic engine, and the U.S. is, as you know, the economy has been faltering, but this additional blow to those very visible symbols of the United States as the center of world finance has shaken investor confidence, and we're seeing that play out in global stock markets.
Now, all financial markets are going to be closed again tomorrow. The New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange will be closed tomorrow.
That's right, Peter. Incidentally, you were talking before about parallels to World War II. Interestingly, U.S. financial markets will be closed now for 48 hours. It's the first time since World War II that that's happened. And keep in mind that the New York Stock Exchange is just a few blocks from the World Trade Center Twin Towers. So in a sense, it's not surprising. It's going to be a while before rescue operations and cleanup operations make it possible for New York Stock Exchange employees to return to work. Having said that, Treasury Secretary O'Neill, who's in Japan today, no word yet on when he will return, certainly trying to reassure everybody, saying the U.S. economy is strong and resilient. We had the Fed issuing messages today saying it will do what must be done to make sure that money continues to flow through the U.S. economy and to make sure the banking system continues to run smoothly, which it did by and large today.
In fact, the global economy and the greater number of stock exchanges in many more places makes 24-hour trading with or without the, well, to some degree, with or without the New York and the American stock exchanges today more possible, does it not?
Yes, it does, Peter. You know, one other thing I wanted to mention to you is there were economists talking today about the possibility that this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, that this might be the event that tips the U.S. economy into recession. I mean, think about it. When markets don't trade, when planes don't fly, when businesses shut down, as we saw so many do today, when malls close, that's a drag on the U.S. economy. People aren't out there spending, and when you've got an economy that's growing at a snail's pace, those kinds of, that kind of slowdown in the economy just for a period of days has the potential to push an economy teetering on recession over the brink.
Thanks very much, Betsy Stark, who will continue to report the economic dimensions of this. You know that largely depending on where you live, I guess, that many of the government and both federal and state offices around the country are closed today. Ironically, the Texas governor granted a 30-day stay to an inmate who faced execution tonight after the worst terror attack in American history, at least on American soil. In Georgia and in many other states around the country, the legislatures ceased doing business if they were in session at the time. And reflecting what we saw on Capitol Hill, maybe we could get that piece of tape up again for people who didn't see it. It was a very moving national moment when members of the House and the Senate stood together and sang spontaneously or not, God Bless America. The Emmy Awards, television's highest awards, which were scheduled for Sunday, next Sunday, have been postponed immediately, and so have another series of awards. There's a whole list of everything that has been postponed or delayed. And when Betsy Stark talks about the Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, who's been saying to the country and the world for the last couple of days, as has the President, that he expects the economy to come back by the end of the year, it is part of an important psychological process as well as a business one to say to the rest of the world, as Senator Tom Daschle did when he talked about Congress will be open for business tomorrow. And that has been reasserted as a government theme at both the state and the federal level throughout the day. And so this scene on the steps of the Capitol building tonight, just as the sun was going down, was very, very moving.
From the mountains to the prairies to the ocean, wide we roam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
We're sometimes pretty cynical or skeptical about politicians, but there is an example of politicians doing what politicians are supposed to do, which is to give their constituents, all of us across the country, some sense of leadership. We're joined now by Pierre Thomas, who covers the FBI and the Justice Department for us. And Pierre, it's early days, but I gather they've got the tiniest direction to go, at least in one of the investigations.
Yes, Peter, we're being told by sources that the FBI has begun to execute a number of search warrants, including in the state of Florida. My source will not give me additional information at this particular time. He emphasizes that it is at the very earliest stages of the investigation. This may turn out to be nothing, but the search warrants being executed are based on the passenger manifest. They have taken some of the names off of the manifest, and they're going to search some of the homes to find if additional clues.
So these are people we believe, or at least we believe the FBI believes, are living in the United States?
Absolutely. These are some of the names that came up on the passenger manifest. They are going to their homes, conducting searches, looking for paper, any kind of information that might lead to answers to why this happened.
We do believe, Pierre, I think from earlier, that one of the stewardesses, one of the flight attendants, my apologies to stewardess, flight attendant, a flight attendant on the American Airlines flight was able to communicate to her base or to somebody else which seat one of the terrorists was sitting in. Does this contribute to the investigation now?
It does, Peter, and a number of sources told me tonight that a number of passengers and flight attendants were able to dial 911 and also reach some of their relatives. And they describe a pretty horrific scene, scenes of people being attacked, in some cases being stabbed. And one source said he could only imagine the horror of what was going on some of those planes.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. Pierre Thomas, who covers the FBI and the Justice Department, who says it's moving, at least in terms of the investigation, and we've known since the last 12 hours of this massive coming together of intelligence operation. And John McCarthy, let me ask you